In the summer of 2015, a satellite image circulated among archaeologists and intelligence analysts that stopped many of them cold. It showed the ancient city of Thuropos in eastern Syria, a site of extraordinary historical significance, a city that had been inhabited continuously from the 3rd century BCE through the 3rd century CE, whose ruins contained remnants of a synagogue, a Christian church, and a temple of Mithras, all coexisting from roughly the same period. The site had been excavated by French and American teams before the Syrian Civil War. It represented an irreplaceable record of the ancient world. In the satellite image, the site looked like the surface of the moon. Thousands of looting pits covered every square meter. Entire sections of the ancient city had been physically excavated by hand, not by archaeologists with documentation protocols and preservation standards, but by looters with shovels, moving as fast as possible. Whatever they found went into trucks. Where the trucks went is the beginning of a story about money, power, and the market for the past. The trade in looted antiquities is not new. It is not a product of the 21st century or even the 20th. For as long as there have been collectors wealthy enough to pay for ancient objects and archaeologically rich territories poor enough to generate the supply, there has been a market. What has changed in the last 2 decades, and particularly since the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the expansion of the Syrian Civil War after 2011, is the scale, the organizational sophistication, and the explicit weaponization of antiquities looting as a revenue source by armed groups. The Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, known variously as ISIS, ISIL, or Daesh, developed a remarkably systematic approach to antiquities as a funding mechanism. In territories under its control, ISIS established what amounted to a licensing bureau for looting. Independent looters who found sites were required to pay a percentage of the value of anything they extracted, a tax, essentially, on archaeological destruction. The organization sent its own teams to the most significant sites. It sold directly to international smugglers through networks that stretched into Turkey, Lebanon, and the Gulf. The revenues generated were significant. Estimates vary widely, from tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars, depending on methodology and time period, but were probably not, as some early reports suggested, one of ISIS's primary funding sources. The primary sources were oil sales, taxation of occupied populations, and bank robberies. Antiquities were a supplementary revenue stream. This distinction matters less than it might seem. Supplementary revenue still funded real operations, and the archaeological destruction was total whether the financial stakes were primary or secondary. The path from a Syrian looting pit to a display case in a collector's home in London, New York, or Geneva typically involves multiple transactions and multiple national borders, each step adding layers of documentation. Some fabricated, some genuinely ambiguous, designed to clean the object's provenance. The first transaction usually happens at or near the source. A local looter sells to a regional middleman, often in cash, for a fraction of the object's eventual market value. The middleman moves the object across a border. Turkey has been a major transit country for Syrian and Iraqi material, partly due to geography and partly due to the chaos of a war zone. In Turkey, the object may sit in a warehouse, change hands again, acquire a first layer of paperwork that obscures its origin. From Turkey or other transit countries, objects typically move to major market hubs. Geneva, because of its favorable customs regulations for temporary storage of valuables, has been repeatedly identified as a key waypoint. Objects can sit in Freeport storage facilities, high-security warehouses that operate outside. Normal customs jurisdiction, for years, while paperwork is assembled and buyers are found. The final buyer is usually either a private collector or a dealer in a major Western market. London, Paris, New York, Tokyo, and various Gulf states have been identified as primary end markets. The prices paid at this stage bear almost no relationship to what the looter received. An object purchased from a looter for $100 may eventually sell at auction for $100,000 or more, with each layer of the supply chain extracting a margin. The documentation problem at the heart of the market is genuinely complex, and not merely because bad actors exploit it. Legitimate antiquities have been changing hands for over a century. Objects purchased legally in the 1920s, before the development of modern export control laws, have clear ownership histories that are entirely unimpeachable from a legal standpoint, even if their original extraction was conducted without the consent of the source country. Objects that passed through the hands of major dealers and auction houses in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s may have documentation that is legally adequate but informationally sparse. Purchase from a European collection is not the same as knowing which site an object came from and under what circumstances. This legitimate complexity creates cover for illegitimate provenance laundering. A well-crafted false provenance history, one that claims an object was in a European collection since the 1960s, is difficult to disprove without forensic evidence. The object may have been in the ground in Syria 6 months ago, but if the documentation is credible and the object has passed through enough hands, the chain of evidence is broken. Forensic archaeology has developed tools for detecting recently looted objects. Soil composition analysis can sometimes identify the region an object came from. Thermoluminescence dating can be used on ceramics. Chemical analysis of patina can reveal whether the apparent aging is genuine or artificially applied. But these methods require the object to be tested, and museums and auction houses are not always enthusiastic about testing their inventory. The institutional side of this problem has produced some notable scandals. The Getty Museum in Los Angeles paid back 40 of its ancient objects to Italy after investigations revealed that significant portions of its antiquities collection had been purchased from a dealer, Giacomo Medici, who had acted as a major conduit for looted Italian material. The evidence came from a raid on Medici's Geneva warehouse in 1995 that uncovered thousands of photographs of objects in fresh-from-the-ground condition, alongside documents connecting them to multiple major American and European institutions. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York returned the Euphronios crater, an ancient Greek vase purchased for $1 million in 1972, to Italy in 2006 after years of dispute about its origin. Marion True, the Getty's former curator of antiquities, was tried in Italy on charges related to the acquisition of looted objects, though the case was ultimately dismissed due to the statute of limitations expiring. The trial produced extensive documentation of how the market operated and how institutions and their curators became entangled in the supply chain. The harm done by antiquities looting operates at multiple levels simultaneously. At the most direct level, it destroys archaeological context, the positional and associative information that gives an object its historical meaning. An artifact removed from the ground by a professional archaeologist is documented. Its layer, its position relative to surrounding objects, its relationship to the architectural features of the site. This context is the data. The artifact itself, absent its context, is a beautiful object, but it is a sentence torn from a book. You can read the sentence, but you have lost the page, the chapter, and the argument. At a higher level, looting destroys the possibility of future knowledge. Archaeology is a destructive science. Excavation destroys the site it studies. This is why professional archaeological practice generates extensive records, photographs, measurements, detailed stratigraphic maps, samples for scientific analysis. Looting generates none of this. When a site is looted, it is not merely that specific objects are removed. It is that every question those objects could have answered, questions about the people who made them, the civilization they belong to, the historical events they might have documented, becomes permanently unanswerable. At the broadest level, the looting and sale of a people's cultural patrimony is a particular kind of violence. It removes from the descendants of ancient civilizations the material evidence of their own history. It transforms heritage into commodity. And it enriches at the far end of the supply chain, collectors and institutions in wealthy countries, while the source countries bear the costs of conflict and impoverishment that make the looting possible. The market persists because the incentives are powerful and the enforcement is weak. International frameworks. The 1970 UNESCO Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property, followed by the 1995 Unidroit Convention, have shifted the legal landscape, but enforcement is inconsistent. The art market in major Western jurisdictions has historically resisted due diligence requirements that would make provenance scrutiny mandatory before purchase. The problem is structural. As long as an object can be laundered through enough hands and enough jurisdictions, as long as collectors and institutions are willing to purchase objects with incomplete provenance histories, as long as the price differential between source and end market remains enormous, the incentive to loot will exist. What fills the looting pits of Dura Europos is not just poverty and war. It is also the demand of collectors who want to own the past. And it is at the very end of that chain, the question of how much the world actually values what it claims to value about history, whether heritage is a principle or a decorative gesture made in comfortable circumstances.